So may I now invite for the next session, the moderator, Mr. J.L. Singh, a man I had the pleasure to introduce a short while ago, but for those who joined in a little later, very briefly, a man of many, many interests, a railwayman by profession, very well traveled, has worked with the railways in every continent of the world, but largely and most importantly, a very serious rail enthusiast and the society and the secretary of our society, and very much the motive power of it. May I hand over to you, J.L. Singh, sir.
Thank you, Mayank. It is good to be back a second time. Anyway, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We had started the day with Australia and then moved to South India and then to East India. And now we transfer ourselves to the Antipodes, to the United Kingdom to be precise. And talking to you from there will be none other than Paul Whittle, the Vice President of the UK-based Darjeeling Himalayan Society. Paul is no stranger to India and has visited the country several times. He has had a lifelong interest in the railways, being a member of the Heritage Railway Association of the UK and several heritage railways of the UK. As a keen traveler, he has visited over 60 countries and studied the railway systems, including countries like Eritrea, Myanmar, Syria, Jordan, Peru, and of course, India. He is a member of the Rail Enthusiast Society and, like Warren Miller, has been a regular contributor to its magazine. Paul will be giving you an overview of all aspects of the UK's rail heritage today, including future challenges and the effect of the current pandemic. With his lifelong association with rail heritage, he is certainly well qualified to delve into the subject. Therefore, let's welcome Mr. Paul Whittle for the fourth talk of the day. Mr. Paul, the stage is yours.
Thank you, JL. Good morning, everyone. It's still morning here in London. It's delightful to be with you. I really must congratulate RES on putting together this global conference. Just think of what we've had already. The wonderful illustrations from Warren Miller. It was lovely to see the improvements at the Mysore Museum. I actually went there in meter gauge days on my very first visit to India. And then, of course, none of us should be without the wonderful Indian Railway Atlas. I love maps. I love what Samit produces for us all. Now, Britain, of course, was right in at the forefront of railway development. So it's probably fairly appropriate that we're now in the forefront of what we might call railway heritage. It is indeed, as JL said, a massive subject. If you think back to 1830, that was when our first purpose-built mainline station was built at Manchester. It's still there across the country. We've got thousands upon thousands of buildings. What I'm going to do is cheat. I'm actually going to concentrate for this session on the extraordinary growth in the last half century of volunteer, privately owned heritage railways. If you bear with me for about a minute or so, I'll get my first picture up on the screen. So here we are. Let's start with just a little bit of background. Until the pandemic struck, our railway system was in very good order. A wonderful safety record, passenger numbers rising to levels which we haven't seen since the heyday of the railways, perhaps a century ago. Huge sums of money being invested in very modern, state-of-the-art rolling stock. So it was all good news. But it hasn't always been good news. And if we think of the period in the decade after the last World War, you can see that our railway system shrank by over 3,000 miles. And this was inevitably due to the rise of road traffic. This was a typical example. We're in southeast England, and the little branch line down to Hawkhurst was my favorite branch line because this was the very first locomotive on which I had a footplate ride. If you're watching closely and you're wondering why the signal looks wrong in relation to the train. Well, this is actually a little push-pull train. The locomotive was steaming away from me, and at the front of the train, there was a driving compartment there. Now, even after the closures of the Beeching Acts, in fact, actually, let's just go back for a minute, just before Dr. Beeching wielded his axe. You can see that despite those earlier closures, we still had a very intense network, 18,000 miles. And if you were in a town and a village, you had a railway station close by. The problem was that the financial losses kept mounting, and the infamous Dr. Richard Beeching was appointed from outside industry to come in and make recommendations as to what was called the reshaping of British railways. Well, as a result of his recommendations, implemented by governments of both right-wing and left-wing persuasion, this was the result. We actually lost another 4,000 miles of track. And so by this time, in a town and a village, you might well have to drive a considerable distance to find a railway station. There was an appeal procedure. People could object to closures. The bodies sit to adjudicate on that. There was a little bit of confusion sometimes about whether the railway system had been reprieved or not. Wonderful story about an old gentleman who walked down to his village railway station waiting for his train, and he waited and he waited. What a poor man. Now, in fact, our railway revival in private hands predated the Beeching cuts. And in mid-Wales in 1951, there was the world record set, because on the Talyllyn Railway, this was the very first narrow gauge railway in the world to be run entirely by volunteers. It had been built in 1865 to carry slate down to the coast for export. A slightly unusual gauge at 2 foot 3 inches and 7 miles long. And from those humble beginnings, it's now a real leading tourist attraction in mid-Wales. Now, it's one thing to deal with narrow gauge equipment. It's relatively cheap. It's relatively light to move around and handle and so on. So it was a full decade before anyone took the bigger step of reopening the first stretch of standard gauge, or 4 foot 8.5 inch track. And this was on the Bluebell Railway in southern England. And from a very limited and modest start with just a couple of miles of track, in the 60 years afterwards, the Bluebell has climbed into what is still the first division of our heritage railways. A wonderful range of locomotives, carriages, rolling stock, the stations, each station decorated or renovated into a particular date in the railway's long history. So the position now is, in fact, this map isn't still quite up to date, but every little red dot on this map shows a heritage railway, and the other dots signify rail centres, steam centres, rail museums, and so on. So it is really, really big business. And let me just give you a few statistics and just show you what a success all this has been. Having a ride on a heritage railway in this country is hugely popular and enjoyable. In a typical year, 13 million people will have a ride on a heritage railway. The amount of track, well, on the standard gauge, it's about 400 miles. On the narrow gauge, it's about 200 miles. And even today, there's still a line which is perhaps extending its route, or sometimes even a completely new operation starts up. So it is still a growth business. The stations, for over 450 of them. So these are all privately owned by the railway. They're privately maintained. They're immaculately looked after. And again, they're period perfect. If you take a particular time in that railway line's history, you'll find that the station matches that. So here we are up in Northern England, in Yorkshire, and here's the station at Harworth. This is on the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway, and that one sprang to fame because it was the scene where a lot of the location filming was done for that famous film, The Railway Children. Here we are at one of the relatively few stations which boasted an overall roof. Now, when the line was closed by British Railways, this overall roof was demolished, the station was derelict, the tracks have been lifted. It's thanks to the new owners, the private owners, that the money was raised for putting this very attractive cover back on the station. These lines tend to be in rural, quite popular and very scenic parts of our country. So here we are in Wales, and we've got the River Dee in the foreground, and on the right-hand side, this is the eastern terminus of another private railway, the Llangollen Railway. And this is a much more modest affair. We're down in Kent, in southeast England, on the Kent and East Sussex Railway. This was built as a light railway. There were government allowances for an encouragement for building these lines, but they were done on a very cheap, basic basis. So this indeed is a very modest station. It's simply constructed of wood and corrugated iron. All these railways need carriages. And so if we look at the standard gauge fleet of carriages across the country, we've got the astonishing number of over 1,400. The carriages I've shown here provide quite a large majority of the rolling stock, and they are actually British Railways Standard Mark I. So in the post-war period, there was a need to replace worn out or damaged rolling stock, and these steel-bodied carriages set a new standard in passenger comfort. A good feature, a basic feature of them, is that the seats are aligned with the windows, and you would hardly believe the aggravation that some of us feel on the modern rolling stock now in service on our mainline network, where you can be given a seat and you're sitting next to a pillar and you can't see out of the train. On the narrow gauge, over 500 carriages. These tend to be wooden bodied, and not many of the originals have survived. So what you will often see is replicas built to an exact design of the original. We can understand in this country people getting excited about steam locomotives, but for every enthusiast worshipping a steam locomotive, there's at least another one worshipping a diesel locomotive. And so across the country, yes, we've got over 600 heritage diesel locomotives. And when I say heritage, well, you can see that the one in the picture was built over 60 years ago. In its day, it was top class, class one, passenger and express freight, hauling trains from London up to the north and so on there. Now it's working out its retirement on the East Lancashire Railway in the northwest of England. This is a fairly basic form of rail transport. They were built about 40 years ago. They only had a design life of about 20 years. It was a sort of cheap, quick fix. It's basically a bus body mounted on a freight wagon underframe. And they're not really liked at all. You can usually tell if it's raining because they leak. Their stability, their motion, sometimes they're called nodding donkeys because on jointed track, they can actually make you seasick. So the last ones are now being retired, although some are actually being handed over to Heritage Railways, who will find them very, very useful. This elderly vehicle here is an electric underground train, and it served in London. It was built in the late 1930s. It's quite literally only in the last month or so that it's been withdrawn from service on the Isle of Wight. And bottom right, this is a new project. It won't be too long before one of the original sets of the Brighton Bell Pullman electric service are restored, and that runs on the third rail network. And it shouldn't be too long before we can see the splendidly restored train doing rail tours for us. And another world record, if you go down to Brighton on the south coast, the Volks Electric Railway is the world's oldest operational electric railway. On the narrow gauge, a lot of diesels, over 300 of them. This is on a 2-foot line in the north of England. In the southeast of England, we're on the Sittingbourne and Kemsley Railway. And you can see the little diesel on the right-hand side has the unfortunate name of Smelly. Well, the reason for Smelly being called Smelly is because Smelly's previous work was done in a narrow gauge network serving a vast sewage works complex. Now, the lines were largely built for freight, and these days, because they're in rural areas, and sometimes they run from almost nowhere to nowhere instead of from a dock to a coal mine or something like that, our heritage railways carry very little freight traffic. But it's part of the heritage atmosphere that they want and they need to preserve fleets of goods wagons. So here we are on the North Yorkshire Moors Railway, and in the foreground, in the siding, the nearest to the camera is a standard van. A little bit further away, that's a cattle wagon, and the blue wagon there, that's a six-wheeled express dairy milk tanker. So this would have brought the milk overnight from the West Country up to London. And this may look an old-time scene of a dirty old freight train. In fact, it's only a couple of years old. This is a reenactment for railway photographers, and the locomotive, instead of being polished so you can see your face in it, it's actually been dirtied for hours and hours, so it looks as though it's really period authentic. This is our most famous luggage van. Nurse Edith Cavell, we can see her in the bottom left of the picture, was a brave British nurse who was shot by the Germans during the First World War. After the end of the war, her body was brought back to this country for burial, and this is how it was transported on the final stages of its journey. So it's called the Cavell van. It also carried a brave sea captain who was also executed by the Germans. And at the end of the war, when the body of our unknown warrior was brought back, this is the van that carried it. What happened to all those steam locomotives? Well, the end of steam on the main line was scheduled for 1968. And for years and years before, thousands of steam locomotives were being sent off for scrap, sometimes in railway workshops or by sale to private scrapyards. And this resulted in the miracle at Barry. A scrapyard was sold about over 200 steam locomotives. The scrap merchant had more than enough work for his labour force already, so he simply parked these locomotives in sidings. It wasn't too long before people started saying, can we buy a bit of that locomotive, or can we buy the whole locomotive for this new branch line, which we're hoping to reopen, and so on. And the scrap merchant realised he was going to make a lot more money by not scrapping his locomotives. And the wonderful story at the end is that by the time his scrapyard eventually closed, virtually all the locomotives that had gone there had been saved. They're being restored. Some of them are still in that condition you can see, but the large majority have been restored and are back in active service. We talked about livery down at Mysore Museum. Livery is a very emotive subject here indeed. Some countries simply paint all their steam locomotives black with red frames, a little bit boring. One of the wonderful features of our railway heritage is that we had some really, really colourful liveries. And here we are on the Bluebell Railway, and just look at these absolutely fabulously beautiful and period authentic, I must tell you, period authentic steam locomotives. This was the last steam locomotive built for British Railways in 1960. It was a heavy freight locomotive. It should have been painted plain black, but because it was the last steam locomotive to be built, it was given a smart green express passenger livery, and it was given the name appropriately of Evening Star. So that's the biggest. On the other end of the scale, this tiny little locomotive, the 060, it was called a Terrier, and that is one of the locomotives which is now back in service on the Bluebell Railway. On the narrow gauge, a lot of steam locomotives. This is the Statfold Barn Railway, which is in the Midlands, and altogether we'll see over 150 locomotives across the country. Some of them you'll find come from abroad. We're on the Leighton Buzzard Railway, 2-foot gauge again, and here's this little Orensteiner couple from 1936. And for another foreign import, this is an American-built Baldwin. So almost 500 of these were bought and used in war service in the Western Front. This one has a strong Indian connection. You can see that after its First World War service, it went to India and it served at the Upper India sugar mills until the 1980s, when it was brought here to Leighton Buzzard. A limited number of steam locomotives are allowed to operate on our national rail network. Initially, there was a complete steam ban between 1968 and 1971. But then British Railways agreed that a limited number of locos maintained naturally to the very highest standards would be allowed to come back onto the main line. And depending on the wheel size, which is the wheel diameter, which is the determining factor, in normal circumstances, they'll be allowed to go up to 75 miles an hour. Some of them are allowed to go up to 90. One exceptionally was allowed to prove that it could still go at 100 miles an hour. It is quite important that these locomotives maintain a good speed, because our main lines are so busy with intensive timetables these days there that you can't have 125 expresses being held up by a steam train plodding along at a mere 60 miles an hour. Another big relief to steam loco operators on the main line was that in 1992, it was agreed that they could run their locomotives over the electrified third rail system. Now, this is to the south, the southeast, the southwest of London. And initially, there were understandable safety concerns about people wanting to go and watch the trains go by, getting too close to the third rail and getting fried in the process. So, but fortunately, common sense and good behaviour has resulted in the area to the south of London now being open for charter train operators, and it made a huge, huge difference. If you want to see the schedule of mainline steam, this is a very good website. Now, clearly, operations are virtually completely suspended at the moment because of the pandemic, but when normal life returns, this is the website to go for. And if any of you are in this country or planning a visit and you have a particular interest in a particular locomotive, then do go onto that website. What about the people who run these privately owned railways? They come in all shapes and sizes, all age, all gender. There are over 4,000 of them who are working on a full-time basis, but you can see that their numbers are vastly exceeded by the number of volunteers, people who give up their time to go and do something which they regard as really satisfying and enjoyable. And here we are. Now, let's take the example of this guard's compartment there. We're on the Bluebell Railway. The guard, in this particular case, he'll perhaps be a volunteer. He will do, say, 3 days a month, something like that. But if the railway is operating its trains for 30 days a month, which it will do during the peak season, you need 10 guards available to do the rostering. So there's a constant need for people, men, women, and as you can see here, you don't need to be a man to drive your own steam locomotive. And there's so many other occupations and trades and so on. All the stations, people admire their gardens. Someone has to do the weeding and the planting and so on. So if you're a keen gardener, you might well look after the garden at your local heritage railway station. And if your heritage railway is running a posh dining car train, and we've already been reminded by Warren of the joys of dining on rail, it's their delight to do their spare time in the kitchen or serving people, and how smart and dedicated and interested and motivated they look. Let's go briefly behind the scenes. This is the area of the railway which your average visitor won't see. Here I'm at the Kidderminster base of the Severn Valley Railway, and I'm in the carriage and wagon workshop, and by pressing a button I can raise the body of this Mark I carriage off its underframe for essential repair and maintenance. Each locomotive needs a home. Each railway needs its own self-contained workshop. In the old days, if there was a problem, the locomotive would be sent off for repair for one of the big centralized railway workshops. But now every railway has to be essentially self-supporting. There are one or two specialist facilities, but by and large, you need to do your own work on site. So this is the locomotive works, quite a modern one, purpose-built at the Bluebell Railway. And here in the north on the Tanfield Railway, there's a rather more traditional and rather basic facility. And of course, every locomotive, every railway needs its own support wagons, its breakdown cranes in case something really goes wrong, or for any lifting that goes on there. And so here's a nicely restored, still in use, a very big heavy-duty rail crane. And this is the carriage and wagon shop at the Bluebell Railway. And again, you can see it doesn't matter if you're in a wheelchair, if you're a skilled carpenter, you're still wanted. This is from a special viewing gallery, and you can stand up there and you can see exactly what work is being done. And there is the challenge. Even today, a heritage railway might get a phone call from a farmer who says, I don't need my chicken coop anymore. Would you like it? And they go along and they find that the chicken coop is a derelict wooden-bodied carriage from 100 years ago. And the trick then is to very carefully remove it to the workshop, get your staff involved, sometimes having to recreate new entire sections from the plans and so on. And the end result is a very, very satisfying transformation just like that. The range of trades in carriage and wagon restoration just goes on and on. Plumbing, electricity, sign writing, someone plumbing the toilet in at the other end there, are hugely varied. Now, these are really the unseen warriors. These are the guys who've done the very unglamorous work of calling what we call the permanent way permanent. And as you can see from this picture there, almost every person in these four pictures is a volunteer. And you can see from the top left-hand picture that some of the equipment needed for relaying track and so on there is quite sophisticated. It's quite big, heavy-duty stuff. And so the top left one is on the Bluebell Railway. They're renewing a stretch of straight track, plain track, with new steel rails and concrete sleepers. And the equipment is either owned by the Bluebell Railway or has been hired in specially by them. And bottom left, well, we can see that every mile of track is 2 miles of boundary where trees grow, fences fall down and need to be replaced. And bottom right, if a set of points needs replacing and it's in a busy time of the year, then these guys could well be up all night working by floodlight. And again, you don't need to be a man to maintain the permanent way. We're back on the little Tulla-Thin Railway, and here's an all-girl crew. Some of the railways have inherited very substantial structures indeed. We're down in the southwest of the country on the Gloucestershire and Warwickshire Railway. And so amongst the skills that they need are people who have got surveying skills, maintenance skills, and so on, for looking after these viaducts, which need to be kept in good condition. This was a real challenge for the Bluebell Railway. It needed to re-establish its mainline connection at a town called East Grinstead to the south of London. But that section of line, when it was closed, had been sold to the local authority, who promptly decided they would use it as a rubbish tip. So the challenge for the Bluebell Railway was to raise the money and organise the massive task of emptying the thousands upon thousands of tons of household waste. They laid a bit of track there. They got refuse or rubbish trains in to fill up with the rubbish and take the rubbish away and put it in a ground somewhere else. It cost a huge amount of money and labour and effort and so on. But the bonus for the Bluebell Railway was that they got back a mainline connection. So people could go down to East Grinstead on the national network, change platforms and continue their journey on the Bluebell Railway. And it also means if you have a mainline connection, excursion trains can come onto your tracks, bringing hundreds of people from anywhere else on the railway system. Slowly but surely, the signal boxes, almost every station used to have its own signal box. Those signal cabins are being replaced by big, centralized, computer-controlled, high-tech facilities. Some of the signal boxes are demolished. Others are simply removed, taken by road and given to a heritage railway. So here we are at Rolvenden on the Kent and East Sussex Railway, and there's a signal box which has only fairly recently arrived. This is my friend Keith. He was a volunteer on the West Somerset Railway in the southwest of England. I spent a day with him in his signal box, and I was hugely impressed by the degree of knowledge that he needed to know. Our heritage railways have almost entirely to conform to a national speed limit of 25 miles an hour. But because they're single track, a head-on crash, 50 miles an hour impact could result in a death, and so on. So the rules, the standard of operating, the standard of competency actually needs to be as high as for the mainline system itself. And where you have level crossings, the level crossings may be the traditional full gate version, again controlled by a local signal box, or if road conditions mean that the road is too busy, then the Heritage Railway may have to go to the considerable expense of installing half barrier or full barrier lifting equipment. A little look at the narrow gauge, and believe it or not, apart from the hedge and the grass and the fields, everything in this picture is new. We're down in the southwest of England on the Linton and Barnstable Railway, and everything in the picture, the locomotive, the carriages, are brand new, but painstakingly accurate copies of the originals. North Wales is an absolute mecca for narrow gauge enthusiasts. And if we go to that box, which I've highlighted, here we've got the famous Festiniog Railway, the inspiration, incidentally, for the Darjeeling Himalayan Railway, the Festiniog Railway going through the wonderful scenery of the Snowdonia National Park. And here at the railway workshops at Boston Lodge near Portmaddock, there's one of the famous double Fairley locomotives. So 2 boilers, 2 power drives, but with the economy of just 1 crew in the middle there. So economic, flexible, powerful, ideal for this narrow gauge line. And the neighbour to the Festiniog Railway at Portmaddock, going north up to Carmarthen on the North Wales coast, is the Welsh Highland Railway. An unusual feature, well, 2 unusual features. If you like Pullman car splendour and comfort, there's the Pullman replica for you. The locomotive is actually a unit which was constructed for use in South Africa, and it's now on its 2nd career here. Almost all our heritage railways are single track, but this is an example of one which has got its double track because it used to be a main line anyway. We're on the Great Central Railway. And so here the normal speed limits can be exceeded. And if you're a filmmaker and you're making a film and you want 2 passenger trains whizzing past each other at 60 miles an hour, this is the place you can come to do it. Here we're on the Wensleydale Railway. We're on the Hentley-Sussex Railway. And this is one of the advantages of using diesels. You can actually sit behind the driver and get a splendid view of the track ahead of you. An extra source of income for the heritage railways is photography, either by day or by night. And so this was a specially created night photography event down at the Bluebell Railway. One of the steam centres is at Didcot. So this is to the west of London on the Great Western Line. The shed on the left-hand side was put up in the 1930s. There's a really excellent collection of Great Western Railway locomotives. And it's a reminder that until 1892, we had a broad gauge network in this country as well. This was the inspiration of Isambard Kingdom Brunel. But problems inevitably arose at the frontier, so to speak, between the 2 systems. And in the 2 right-hand pictures, you can see what would happen there. There would be shipment facilities where passengers would change platforms or where goods would be manhandled or crane handled from one standard gauge line, say on the left-hand side, to the broad gauge on the right-hand side. And you can actually see in both pictures on the right-hand side, there's a section of mixed gauge because at the frontiers, you often found that the gauge of one system would be extended into the territory of the other one. But it never made long-term sense. And so this is why the Great Western Railway was forced to abandon its broad gauge system and conform to what the rest of the country was doing. Didcot is a wonderful facility. You get just a glimpse of it on the left-hand side. There's an example of almost every aspect of railway operating here. even down to the small items. On the left-hand side, one of the little huts which were being put up for the protection of those early railway policemen who were actually the forerunners of signal box operators there. Now we're going to have a look at one vehicle which used to be part of our royal train. And here it is, and we're on the Severn Valley Railway. And this was an armoured saloon constructed during World War II for the King and Queen to travel around. And there's the King's study on the left-hand side. There's King George VI and the Queen visiting troops, making morale-boosting visits. And there's the saloon, the living room, so to speak. Very plain, no gold, no chandeliers, but of course this was built with wartime economy in mind. We're up in Scotland, and here's an example of a privately operated train operating on the public national network. And if you've seen the Harry Potter films, you'll know that the Harry Potter Hogwarts Express takes its trip across the wonderfully attractive concrete Glenfinnan Viaduct. And you might also remember that Harry Potter set off on his travels from platform 9 3/4 at King's Cross Station. And if you go to the station, well, yes, at any time of the day or night, you can see someone trying to push their trolley or their half trolley through the wall onto the mythical platform 9 3/4. Network Rail are responsible for maintaining our national network structures. And one of the jewels in their crown is the Forth Railway Bridge in Scotland. Born in 1880 and more recently in the last few years, given UNESCO World Heritage Site status. I was invited by Network Rail to go right up to the top of the bridge, and the views from the top, well, as you can see, they are absolutely stunning. The Isle of Man, well, this is the little island, lies halfway between the UK mainland and the island of Ireland itself. That has got its own network of heritage transport, and this is the Isle of Man Steam Railway, wonderfully scenic. In terms of museums, well, the jewel in our crown is the National Railway Museum at York. It's right adjacent to the mainline station. It's a free facility, got some wonderful exhibits there. This is what happened at Penydarren in 1804. So this was a full quarter of a century before George Stephenson and his rocket and everything else. So 1804, really important in railway heritage. This was the world's first locomotive-hauled railway journey. Our most famous locomotive is undoubtedly the Flying Scotsman, 1923 built there, and the very first steam locomotive to officially reach 100 miles an hour. And Mallard, well, yes, it is still the proud holder of the world speed record for a steam locomotive, attained in the year of its construction in 1938, when it reached the astonishing and not since exceeded speed of 126 miles per hour. The North Yorkshire Moors Railway. This is the area in the little red box on the map. So yes, 1836 opened, lasted 130 years when it was shut down, and reopened 1973 over an 18-mile section. Here it is. So it's at the bottom of the map. There's Pickering. It goes up to the junction at Gromont, but something significant happened in 2007 because the North Yorkshire Moors Railway was allowed to run its trains over the national network down to the coast at Whitby. So here's the view of the junction at Gromont, and here is the terminus, if you like, of the line now at Whitby, and we've got a Network Rail diesel. There's a pacer on the left-hand side, but look, which is the more popular. Look at those crowds of people queuing up to join the North Yorkshire Moors private train for their ride up onto the North York Moors. And there's a view of the train leaving Whitby. The ruined Abbey, there's a Dracula connection there, very, very popular East Coast holiday resort. And today, the North Yorkshire Moors is one of our most popular heritage railways. It runs special events, it has wartime reenactment weekends, and it actually had a lineup of these three very impressive A4 streamlined Pacifics. We're still building new steam locomotives. Tornado.
Paul, you have 5 minutes more.
Okay, thank you. Tornado set the pace and followed on there. Lady of Legend, well, she combines the frames and the boiler of other steam locomotives. So that was a sort of half rebuild. Prince of Wales will be our most powerful locomotive in the country. And there it is. It's due to be completed in 2024. This is our Unknown Warrior. This is our commemorative locomotive. It recreates this locomotive that ran on the London Midland Scottish. And here is a smaller locomotive, which is being recreated. And here it is there. And what usually happens is you start with the underframes, you then raise money for the wheels. The most expensive bit is, of course, always the boiler. Thomas the Tank Engine, very, very popular fundraising for the Heritage Railways. They put on special events. The mums and the dads and the children come down there, and the little engines they've read about in their books or seen on TV, they can actually have a ride behind Thomas the Little Blue Tank Engine. The Heritage Railway Association is the overarching coordinating body for our heritage railways. And as you can see, they are into setting standards, giving advice, they provide training, and they give awards for best practice. The COVID had a desperate effect on our heritage railways. Like everything else, 23rd of March, there was a total shutdown. In August, limited services resumed. A lifeline was thrown by the government, who quite generously in October of last year gave grants to 30 of the heritage railways of £11 million. We're hoping as things improve that these heritage railways will restart their operation in probably the next 2 months or so. Challenges, well, there are lots of challenges. UK is about to shut down its last source of homegrown or home mined fuel. The ageing volunteer workforce is a challenge. The railways need to be constantly encouraging young people to come on board, preserving heritage engineering skills, all sorts of schemes in place to make sure that the old skills aren't lost. Visitor interest, you want people to come back to your heritage railway time and time again. So you've got to provide a variety of activities. Climate change, watch out for the drains and the landslides and the water, dramatic changes in climate and so on. Money is always a challenge. Safety, what the mainline network has an impeccable safety record. We have to ensure that these part-time volunteers are able to keep those standards on the private railways. In terms of funding, just a quick look and make the point that the ticket sales usually cover only about half of the operating costs there. The rest is made up from the souvenir shop, catering operations, and other one-off events. In terms of capital project for big, making a new engine shed, extending your line and so on, are various ways of you getting money. You can attract donations. People can be asked to sponsor a particular bit of a new locomotive or the extension to a station. Some people might be encouraged to provide an interest-free loan to their favourite railway. Shares are issued. These are limited companies. They will issue shares. The Railway Heritage Trust will give grants, and the Heritage Lottery Fund, our national lottery scheme, will also chip in sometimes with very significant amounts of money. I must mention very briefly, as you recall, I'm the Vice Chairman of the DHRS. These are our two latest publications. Summit will love the maps in Up the Line to Darjeeling. They was produced in close cooperation with both Indian Railways and UNESCO. If you want to know anything more about the DHR, there's our website at the bottom. And if you've got any feedback or questions that we don't have time for now during this fabulous conference, then do contact me direct, please, on my email at pro@dhrs.org. So there we are. I hope you've enjoyed what is undoubtedly a real whistle-stop tour of our railway heritage, but hopefully we'll have time for a few questions. So thanks very much, and back to you, JL.
Thank you, Paul, and congratulations. You finished absolutely on time. I mean, right down to the last second.
Thank you.
This shows,
it wasn't planned,
the kind of experience you have in, say, giving talks.
Thank you.
See, there is no doubt that if the UK led the world in pioneering the railways, Today, they're leading the world when it comes to rail heritage. Therefore, it was a very illuminating talk, a talk that every rail enthusiast in India must hear. And I hope we have learned enough from it and can take a few lessons from you.
Thank you.
There are a few questions and a very large number of comments. I'll try and go through some of them. Raghunandan writes, can't help noticing the authenticity of the livery, the lettering, and the general quality of restoration. He says, why can't we in India achieve the same levels of excellence? It's not lack of money, certainly. The answer lies in the fact that the institutional mechanism provides for private enthusiasts to enter into the field of railway restoration, operation and maintenance of heritage lines and properties, and even earn money to keep it sustainable. Would that be correct, Paul?
Sorry, just say that last bit again. You're saying...
What Raghunandan writes is that the answer of why we in India can't do the same thing. He says the answer lies in the fact that the institutional mechanism provides for private enthusiasts to enter into the field of railway restoration, operation and maintenance, and even earn money to keep it sustainable. Apparently, we in India can't do it.
This is a question I've pondered, and a lot of people have pondered for a long time. How do we somehow get this private participation, and how do we get the enthusiasm and commitment of the volunteers who alone make running these operations economically viable? It's very, very difficult to give advice really from thousands of miles away. What I often try to do is say that anyone who is seriously wanting to answer these questions, when time permits, do come here and use your own eyes and ears and get your impression and talk to people here, because then at least for your own local conditions, you can help make your own judgments. I think that a business model, which I would recommend from here, might be completely inappropriate. We've got, 20,000 willing volunteers. Well, in proportion to our populations, if you multiply that in proportion, it would mean you probably have several million, in theory, volunteers in India. But of course, it doesn't work like that. The geography is different as well. Virtually all our heritage lines are accessible to anyone living in the country because they're fairly close to each other. You're spread out, so very, very much more. Distances are an issue. Income is a different. Have people got the disposable income to do this holidaying, enjoy their activity? Have they got the time to do it? If you're a railwayman, you come to the end of your career. Do you want to carry on doing something like that? Well, some of these volunteers are simply perpetuating their full-time service. They're taking their skills into retirement. It's a big question. I honestly can't say I've got the knowledge. Certainly, you need some sort of enthusiasm from the centre. You've got a traditional style of a nationalised railway, and Indian Railways will decide absolutely everything. I think somehow you've got to introduce perhaps a bit more incentive for people to make up a new rule and do something. Take one example. If you go to one of our heritage railways, you will get the offer of a reasonably priced, good quality guidebook to the railway. Now, can you go to any of India's hill railways and buy that? No, you can't. And that's just a very, very basic example about how a little bit more local initiative needs to be done so that people showing initiative can actually be rewarded for that initiative. So, but I don't have the answer, honestly. I'd love to hear what other people think the answer might be.
Somehow we have to get our younger generation interested. I think that is probably one answer. And that is one thing the Rail Enthusiast Society is trying to do.
That's right. Yeah. Personal influence and personal conviction as well. And so we tend to find with Indian Railways that, as someone said, officers stay in post for perhaps 2 years and are then moved on. And anything you're trying to do with a particular individual, well, you know you've got a maximum of 2 years before he or she is gone. You know, I suppose for the DHR, we are the continuity organisation. We've been doing our job and been involved with the DHR for 2 decades, something like that. In that time, I've met, you know, 10 DRMs and 7 GMs and all that sort of thing there. Continuity is quite a challenge, really, in getting anything changed.
Good observation, Paul. There's an interesting comment from Raghunandan. He said, the other thing that strikes me is that while India has several rail-worthy restored locomotives, we hardly have any rail-worthy rolling stock. It looks incongruous that Fairy Queen or Express should pull a modern coach. In the UK, heritage trains are heritage trains from end to end, not an old loco pulling a modern rake.
That's a very good observation, actually, JL. It's one that I wasn't going to be provocative and raise it, but no, it's exactly the view that I have from here. In this country, as you've seen from my photos, if you want for filming or anything else, you want an old style passenger train or you want an old style goods train, we've got the capacity to do that. And as you say, it's all very well putting a nice steam engine on the front, but if it's always modern bodied stuff at the back, or if you can't actually recreate a goods train for a filmmaker or for photographic opportunity, then something's meant. So someone does actually need to think seriously about the rolling stock issue. There's no doubt about that at all.
Vikas Singh has a comment. He says there's a big difference in approach. The heritage in railway in UK is private funded. In India, we expect the Indian Railways and the government to do everything. By and large, I would agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, yeah. The government, I think, is very responsible towards heritage on our national network. But as you say, in terms of the private heritage issue there, the huge majority of the funding does come from people's private pockets, and somehow you need to kindle that enthusiasm, and of course, whether you can afford it or not is just another issue. Until people have a certain level of disposable income, they won't contribute.
There's a question from Rohit, but I think that will require a separate session to answer. He says, I heard privatizing operational railways in UK has not been very rewarding, and UK is looking for options to renationalize. Is that true?
Oh, wow. We could take a whole weekend on that.
Separate session.
Well, views about privatization vary tremendously. Some people say it's been a huge success. The rising passenger numbers, the modern rolling stock and everything else has been a wonderful success. Other people say if you'd left British Railways alone, then they could have probably done all this lot without a lot of lawyers getting involved, with different companies being formed, with franchises being negotiated and so on there. Really what we've got is the national network is effectively nationalised. Network Rail, it's funded by the government. It's pretty well government controlled by the Department of Transport and so on there. So that's the nationalised bit. The problem comes with the train operating companies. These are the people who are given contracts or franchises to run train services there. It's come to a head because of the pandemic, because passenger numbers have gone absolutely down into the basement, and the train operating companies were faced with appalling losses, fixed costs and so on there. So I think probably the best thing to do is ask me the question again next year when we're hopefully all back to normal.
No, we propose to have this similar conference next year. This can be your subject of next year's talk.
I wish I hadn't offered that.
Anyway, we have a few more comments and a few more questions, but time has run out. So we will end here. Thank you very much, Paul. I'll read you one comment which sort of sums up what I wanted to say. This is from Suprit Roy. Thank you, Paul, for a fabulous presentation. I worked in the UK 2008 to 19 when I discovered these great volunteer-run heritage lines and became a big fan. Your show brought back great memories. So with that, we end this talk. Thank you very much again, Paul, and hope to see you again next year.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I would now like to hand over to Vikas for the next question of the day.
Okay, so we
Vikas,
are sharing, So we are sharing the third question of the day, and let's hope we get the right answer fast. Now, all the cricket fans out there should get it very quickly. Spin bowler from the Railways Ranji team who played several tests for India in the 2000. What's his name? Yeah, Rohit got it correct very fast. It is Murli Karthik. Well done, Rohit. So it is Murli Karthik. We now hand over to Mayank to do the introductions for the next session. Mayank?
Thank you, Vikas. Rohit, we had actually factored in something like 2 to 3 minutes for each of these questions. You just destroyed it by finishing it in like 10 seconds. But
Ian is there, so
we are going to stay with our promise. So meanwhile, can I also remind you that you still have 1 hour to go before you submit your entries for the quiz for masters. As I had reminded you earlier, the quiz for masters can be accessed from our website, which is railenthusiastindia.org.in. But when you say these things verbally, sometimes it doesn't make as much sense. So let me try to use the 1 or 2 minutes that I have just now to actually, this of course was our request okay. And while this loads up, so there we are. That is our quiz for masters created by Ajay Banerjee. So confident were we about I'm so sure were we that you'd not find the answers on Google, that it's actually a take-home quiz. So yeah, Google, we beat you hopefully. And the way to get to this quiz is visit our website, railenthusiastindia.org.in, and navigate to the activities and events section. You'll find a button there which says quiz for masters, which is open for just a little over 1 hour now. So please go right ahead and give it a shot, because we've interestingly got quite a few responses now, but just a little under an hour from now, we will shut out on that particular quiz.